Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Isal, and I work as a researcher in the Transnational Threats and International Crime program at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. Today, I have the pleasure of presenting a recently published report called Preventing Violent Extremism Lessons from Africa. And I will be discussing some trends that surfaced in the report. But before I get to the trends, I would first like to describe how this report came to be. So last year, 2018, we published the report Preventing Extremism in West and Central Africa, where we mapped 133 PVE projects implemented by 67 organizations in the 6 West and Central Africa countries. And then more recently, in this year, we published the sister report Preventing Violent Extremism in East Africa, and we managed to map 148 PVE projects implemented by 117 organizations. So we used the same semi-structured questionnaire to gather data in both studies, and this enabled us to not only gather a huge amount of data, but also to be able to write a comparative report, which this one does. However, because of the high amount of data, we only decided on certain trends to highlight in this Preventing Violent Extremism report. And the trends that we are discussing in this report touch on monitoring and evaluation, challenges, funding amounts, donor organizations, and theories of change. So I would like to discuss 5 trends today. The first trend is about the general work these organizations do, or rather the field of activity. So in the questionnaire that we used to gather data, we started asking questions broadly about the implementing organization and then narrowed it down to specific PVE projects. But one of the questions that we asked about the organizations was the general work these individuals do. And what it showed us that only a very small number of organizations actually label their general work they do as preventing violent extremism. The more cited vocabulary that they used was advocacy and the promotion of human rights, peace building and violence prevention, and then the often mentioned vocational training and education. And the data that we gathered during this question actually added to the recent debate around whether preventing violent extremism is so much different from the peace-building efforts that we've seen being implemented on the African continent for the past decades. And we can see more and more that PVE practitioners and implementing organizations are including development and humanitarian aid aspects into the design of their projects. So one of the respondents shared a story with me and said that to incentivize participation in their projects, they had to advertise that they will be providing food and water to the participants who will be attending the workshop. Otherwise, people are reluctant to leave their livelihood activities for the day to attend a PVE workshop. So one can argue that development and humanitarian aid projects cannot successfully be implemented in countries where conflict exists. But then on the other side of the coin, one can also say that preventing violent extremism projects cannot be successfully implemented without involving a development and humanitarian aid aspect. The second trend is around the funding. We asked the organizations about the funding amounts and their donor organizations. And thanks to this question, we were able to successfully map where the money is coming from and where it is going to. And we categorized the 3 main donors into the United States, the European Union, and individual states within Europe, and then lastly, intergovernmental organizations like GSIRF, the Global Center on Cooperative Security, and then the UN and its various agencies. And I know everyone's very curious to know who is the biggest donor behind PVE projects in Africa, and it is the United States. This then led us to the trend that discusses the advantage or disadvantage from receiving external funding versus receiving internal funding. Only a very small number of organizations said that they are receiving funding from either their own organizations or private donors within their countries. And since we all know that development aid towards Africa has been in a steady decline, we need to ask when African states will take responsibility and accountability in addressing the threat of violent extremism or supporting the organizations already implementing these initiatives on their soil. And by supporting, I don't necessarily mean funding towards these projects, but just providing any kind of support that these organizations may need. The third trend I would like to discuss is the theory of change. And the most cited theory of change that came up during these two studies was that by raising awareness, they will increase resilience and decrease vulnerability to violent extremism. And I know that this might raise a few eyebrows because ignorance is not necessarily always considered as a driver of violent extremism. I know whoever's watching this video, whether you are a policymaker, whether you are a PVE practitioner, donor organization, or academic, I believe that every person working in this field has a different opinion on what drives violent extremism. It can either be abuses by security forces, or it can be ignorance or poverty or unemployment. So this is why I'm saying the fact that such a high number of respondents said awareness raising could be disagreed with in the international realm. But what I do want to say about the raising awareness, once we prompted the respondents to go into a little bit more detail, because raising awareness is such a blanket term, it could mean anything. One of the most interesting things that came out was the fact that awareness raising to them means opening the minds and removing the stigma around certain groups. So what this referred to is preparing the communities to accept back former combatants defecting from these violent extremist groups, as well as the victims of these violent extremist groups who were either forcefully recruited or kidnapped. The sad reality is that women and children that are saved from groups like Boko Haram, like the Boko Haram brides, still remain in their isolated communities and are excluded from their communities and cannot return due to the stigma. So the awareness raising that's taking place also refers to talking with communities, removing the stigma, and promoting for these individuals to return to their communities. The fourth trend, and maybe the most important one, especially when I'm talking to PVE practitioners and researchers, is the topic around monitoring and evaluation. We asked the respondents whether they have monitoring and evaluation plans in place, and most of them said yes. The more interesting aspect is when I asked them about the more informal methods of evaluating. So how I pose this question is I asked them if they were to walk into a room where one of their PVE activities were taking place at that point, what would they need to see to be able to tell me that their activities are achieving the intended results? And what we gathered was a lot of these organizations and respondents are focusing on observations and very informal observations. And these observations, I'm afraid, will not be able to hold any water in an M&E report, which is obviously often required by donor organizations. And even though the organizations do have monitoring and evaluation plans in place, there seems to be a confusion around what is an outcome indicator and what is an output indicator. The way forward, I would say, in terms of the monitoring and evaluation is to look at the very informal ways that these organizations are reviewing and evaluating their projects, because it will lead donor organizations in their development of outcome indicators. We need to understand how very local grassroots organizations consider success or no success. The last trend I would like to discuss is the labeling of PVE projects. This trend came across when we asked the respondents about the challenges that they experienced during the implementation of projects. And one of the most frequently mentioned challenges was community perception and fear. PVE organizations are often met with hostility from communities because firstly, they do not understand what PVE means, and secondly, they are afraid that the PVE organization is there to label them as vulnerable or as possible violent extremists. So Something that definitely came out during this report, and something that I don't know whether we think about enough, is the possible negative effect these PVE projects have. And when discussing this aspect with the respondents, I understood that the communities are not irrational when they fear PVE organizations. Some organizations explained to me that in the areas in the countries where the most PVE projects are being implemented, there's also a high concentration of military and security forces. So by implementing a PVE project with the community, we are informally labeling them as vulnerable and marginalizing them even further. Not only are they then informally stigmatized as vulnerable, but they also face hostility from other communities who are not necessarily labeled as vulnerable, but who are not benefiting from PVE projects and the activities that they entail. So in conclusion, I did not even touch on the recommendations or all the findings that came out in this report, and I really invite you to please read the report. The link will be in the description below. Thank you very much.